Let's talk about hedonism. You've probably heard that word thrown around, right? Usually to describe a life of just pure, nonstop indulgence. But what if I told you that's barely scratching the surface of a huge, really complicated and fascinating philosophical puzzle? We're about to dig into the real story behind the pursuit of pleasure. So right now, when I say the word hedonist, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Seriously, is it someone at a wild party, a globe-trotting thrill seeker? Go ahead, get that image in your mind and hold on to it for a second.
Yeah, I'm willing to bet your mental image looks something like this, doesn't it? A life that's all about chasing those immediate highs, maybe without a lot of thought for what comes next. You know, this view is so common it actually has a name. People call it folk hedonism.
And look, that stereotype exists for a reason, but it's such a tiny and honestly kind of misleading part of a much bigger conversation. The real philosophy of hedonism, it is way more thoughtful and frankly a whole lot more interesting.
So let's pull back the curtain and go beyond that stereotype. Because philosophical hedonism isn't just one thing, it's more like a whole family of related ideas, and they all revolve around one central theme: the role that pleasure plays in our lives.
See, at its core, philosophical hedonism is really about trying to answer three fundamental questions. It's not just about what feels good. It's about 1, what actually drives our actions? 2, what do we consider to be truly good or valuable in life? And 3, what's the right way for us to act? Getting this framework is the key to understanding the whole thing.
And that framework gives us 3 really distinct theories. You could call them the 3 faces of hedonism. So let's break them down one by one, starting with the theory that tries to explain what really makes us all tick.
First up is psychological hedonism. Now this is a big one. This isn't a theory about how we should behave. It's a claim about how we actually behave, whether we realize it or not. The idea is that deep down, every single thing we do, from grabbing a snack to doing a favor for a friend, is ultimately driven by our desire to feel good and avoid feeling bad.
The 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes was a huge champion of this view. He argued that even our most generous acts are, at their root, selfish. We help others because it gives us a good feeling, or boosts our reputation, or in some way brings us pleasure. It's a pretty provocative claim about the very nature of humanity.
Okay, so if psychological hedonism is all about what drives us, our next theory, axiological hedonism, is all about value. And it makes a really bold claim. Pleasure is the only thing that's good in and of itself. Everything else we think is good, money, friendship, knowledge, is only valuable because it's a tool that helps us get to pleasure.
Here's a super simple way to think about it. You want pleasure just for the sake of pleasure. You don't need another reason. It's good on its own. That's intrinsic value. But what about money? You don't want paper just to have paper. You want it for what it can get you: the house, the vacation, the food, the things that bring you pleasure. That's instrumental value. It's a tool.
All right, so once you've decided what's valuable, the next question is pretty obvious, right? What's the morally right thing to do? And that brings us to our third phase, ethical hedonism. This theory argues that our moral obligation, our duty, is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. But right here, the road splits into 2 totally different directions. On one side, you've got egoistic hedonism, which says, hey, your only moral duty is to your own happiness. Go get it. But on the other side, you have utilitarian hedonism, which says the right action is the one that creates the most good for the most people, the greatest total pleasure for everyone, even if you have to sacrifice your own. Okay, but let's be real. The idea that a good life is all about maximizing pleasure, well, it's run into some pretty powerful challenges over the centuries. Let's take a look at a couple of the most famous thought experiments that really put this idea to the test.
I want you to imagine something. There's a machine, and if you plug into it, it can give you any experience you could possibly desire. You could be a rock star, an astronaut, a celebrated artist, anything. Inside the machine, it would feel completely real, and you'd be perfectly happy. But there's a catch. You have to stay plugged in for the rest of your life, never knowing it's all just a simulation. So, would you do it?
So this famous thought experiment comes from the philosopher Robert Nozick, and he called it the experience machine. And he argued that most of us, we'd say no, we wouldn't plug in. And why not? Because apparently we care about more than just how we feel on the inside. We want our achievements to be real. We want a genuine connection to reality. And that suggests that maybe, just maybe, pleasure isn't the only thing we truly value.
So the experience machine is a challenge from the outside, But there's another major challenge that comes from inside our own heads. It's a psychological phenomenon called the hedonic treadmill. It's this idea that no matter what happens to us, good or bad, we have a tendency to adapt and eventually return to our own personal, stable level of happiness.
And you can actually see this in action. Take a look at what happens when people go through huge life events. Getting married can cause a big spike in life satisfaction. A major loss can cause a deep dip. But notice the trend. Over time, people tend to drift back toward their original baseline. It suggests that maybe chasing those big, life-altering highs might not be a sustainable strategy for long-term happiness.
Now, all of these ideas and debates, they are not new. I mean, people have been arguing about pleasure and happiness for literally thousands of years. So let's take a quick walk through history to see how this whole philosophy evolved.
Our journey starts way back in ancient Greece with a guy named Aristippus. His whole philosophy was basically seize any immediate physical pleasure you can. But right after him came Epicurus, who went in a completely different direction. He argued true pleasure is about long-term tranquility and moderation. Flash forward a couple thousand years to Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism, who said we need to create the most pleasure for the most people. And then his student, John Stuart Mill, came along and refined that idea, arguing, hey, maybe some pleasures like learning and art are just better and higher quality than others. And this contrast right here between the first two guys, it's perfect. It shows you just how incredibly diverse hedonism can be. On one side, you have Aristippus, whose philosophy is pretty darn close to that folk hedonism stereotype we started with. But on the other side, you've got Epicurus, teaching that the greatest pleasure comes from a simple, calm life, free from fear and pain. You have two philosophers who both called themselves hedonists, but they had completely different maps for how to live a happy life.
Okay, so, ancient Greeks, 18th century philosophers. Why should you care about any of this today? Well, because these ideas are absolutely everywhere, shaping our modern world in some pretty surprising fields.
For instance, think about the entire field of positive psychology. It's basically the scientific study of what makes life fulfilling and happy. Or in economics, where some policymakers are trying to measure a country's success not just by its GDP, but by its gross national happiness. And in animal ethics, that utilitarian idea of minimizing pain and maximizing pleasure for all beings that can feel it, that is a fundamental principle of the animal rights movement.
And that brings us to the big, final question. We've seen so many different ideas of pleasure, from the intense, momentary thrill that Aristippus chased, to the calm, quiet tranquility that Epicurus valued, from simple physical feelings to the complex, intellectual joys that Mill talked about. So maybe the real question hedonism forces us to ask isn't just if we should pursue pleasure, but what kind of pleasure is actually worth building a life around.